Welcome to the third day of our Globalization Week, dear ladies and gentlemen. We had some great talks. We have reached halftime, and today it's the turn of James Giordano and Jutta Almendinger. Our overarching topic is globalized societies, and it is my greatest pleasure to introduce as the first speaker Professor James Giordano, who is, if you allow me to say, very old and good friend, even a wingman. Professor James Giordano is one of the leading philosophical medics or medical philosophers in the United States. He was leading in the creation of the Decade of the Mind, which was a program dedicated to enlarge brain research to something more encompassing, also more ethical. And he was also leading in the so-called NELSI program of the American Military Research Agency, which tries to include ethical, legal, and social aspects into the research into brain science. Professor Giordano is a professor at the departments of neurology and biochemistry of Georgetown University. He's chief of the Neuroethics studies program, and he is leading in advising the American government on the ethics of brain research. And this is extremely important in my view, because as we all know, brain research is in the process of really changing the fundamentals of our understanding of the human being and will without doubt have a major impact on the future of globalization. So it's my biggest pleasure to welcome Jim Giordano. Please, Jim, take the stage.
Thank you so very, very much. Thank you, Dr. Benedicta, and thank all of you for having me here. I mean, it's a true pleasure to be able to share my views, my perspectives with each and all of you on this very, very important topic of globalization. And so I believe it becomes an important issue for us to understand the nature of what globalization is and utilize, in this particular case, an exemplar. And the exemplar that I'd like to use, if I may, is that of neuroscience and neurotechnology. And the reasons for that is that what we're really looking at is the nature of global health promotions. And I think that becomes ever important. You know, if we consider the idea of globalization ever more, as Dr. Benedicta has alluded to in the past, and very presciently, the nature of globalization is one that is precedented on the new global shift, the new global shift. I mean, if we take a look at current economic predictions, and once again, if you'll apologize, I'll apologize to you for using neuroscience and technology as the exemplar. It is my area of expertise, and it is also that which I have the deepest and longest knowledge of with regard to its development and trajectory. But I think in many ways, it is not only an exemplar of bioscience and technology, but overall progress in the field of technology, because it represents an area of rapid growth. It's also exceedingly profound. Now, I'm not being performative here. Let me explain why we believe neuroscience and technology is somewhat profound, both as an exemplar and unto itself. In many ways, what neuroscience has attempted to do is to address the long-standing, perdurable questions of philosophy. If we go back to the region of Descartes, we can see that the cogito asked, cogito ergo sum, a statement, I think, therefore I am. But the question embedded within that, perhaps tacitly, is what makes me think? And further, if we regard ourselves, as Roland Benedicta once again presciently stated, and I allude here to some of our previous work over a decade ago, that we are in fact Homo sapiens by our own calling, but Homo sapiens technicus. We are the knowing human, but we know because of our interesting heuristic of using tools of observation, tools of instrumentation, tools of artifact, engagement, to know things. And evermore, what we're learning is about ourselves. We're turning those tools inwardly, not only to assess ourselves, but to affect ourselves. And in that way, our sense of Homo sapiens technicus is becoming ever more that we are the engineers of our own evolution. But what will we build and how will we build it? The very same technology that allows us to look outward to the stars and inward to that universe of ourselves has also allowed large trends in globalization, has allowed very rapid communication in real time, the ubiquity of information via the internet, access to ongoing information very often in ways that are non-anonymous, travel, relocation, engagement of the ecology, inclusive of our own ecologies. Therefore, neuroscience and technology becomes a means for us to adapt, for us to relate, for us to change. It will, in fact, be focused ever more upon ourselves in ways that change not only the human condition and the human predicament of suffering and pain, but perhaps what it means to be a human, fusing ourselves iteratively with a variety of machines and what some has referred to as the transhuman evolution, not in ways such as that had been perhaps advocated by various political figures, but in true ways of transhumanity, the human in transition. But what does that transition portend when it is executed ever more largely on the global stage? Recent predictions from the Neurotechnologies Industries Organization have determined that global economic scales of neuroscience and neurotechnology for the next 5 years, from 2025 through 2030, I mean, that's just a few years away, will see the ascendance of neuroscience and technology as a viable scientific, economic, and perhaps biopowerful force in Asia, overcoming that of the United States and Western Europe. It used to be the West and the rest, but no longer. Other dominant factors in the rise of the globalization of neuroscience and technology include Russia, India, several South American companies. And if we look to what this means, what we see is that neuroscience and technology captures greater than 175 billion US dollars in annual market growth. The variety of its sub-disciplines, pharmacology, devices, analytics, each and all contributing to that. And although neuroanalytics, in other words, big data utilized in neuro together with artificial intelligence, at this point is only a 3.7 annual growth yield, has a high fiscal return and a high importance return with regard to the way we utilize data and information in neuroscience, which literally puts the brain in our fingertips. Diverse domains of utility, effect, and influence of the brain sciences are certainly aimed at the lowest hanging fruit: healthcare, bioscience, a life science employed towards bettering the sustainability and quality of life, for sure. But it's not just a question of survival any longer. More and more, we're working, if you will, in preventive ways, and in some cases, ways to better ourselves. We utilize our science and technology, and neuroscience and technology is no different, to advance human flourishing. Flourishing. Not just in the face of disease, but because ever more we define ourselves by our cognitive capabilities, by our comparative capabilities with each other, with ourselves, with what we were yesterday, to make ourselves somewhat better tomorrow. And more the brain sciences are infiltrating different aspects of our daily life. In some cases, ubiquitously and conspicuously, such as direct-to-consumer marketing and the rise of a do-it-yourself neurotechnology market. And in other ways, perhaps more subtly, the use of the prefix, for example, neuro, conspicuously throughout the literature and information we read, a reliance upon the brain sciences to define what it is we think, how we think, and perhaps who we are, to define norm and abnorm, and ever more leveraging the brain sciences in global relations, fields such as neuroeconomics, neuromarketing, neuropolitics. And then we must ask, politics in what dimension? Politics of influence, the politics of deference, the politics of deterrence, the politics of defense. In full transparency, I must tell you that much of my work over the past 15 years has been focused upon those possible ways that the brain sciences can, will, are, and perhaps should or should not be utilized in various international agenda of national security, intelligence, and defense, or what is now referred to as WINS, warfare, intelligence, and national security. I had the great privilege and honor of serving for a time on the European Union Human Brain Project's task force on dual-use neuroscience. As science fictional as that sounds, it is here today. It is a reality. As global headlines demonstrate, the use of putative neuroweapons to be able to influence individuals in ways that are non-kinetic, in other words, below the threshold of what might be considered for warfare, is indeed a clear and present danger. We need only look at some of the events that have occurred to US personnel at the embassy in Havana. And that becomes very important. Very important. Why? Because more and more what we're seeing is the need to appreciate what brain science can do and will do on the global stage. Part of that refers to how easy it is to get the brain sciences to work on a global level. The facility of acquiring neuroscientific tools and gaining methods is literally at our fingertips. Much of it is available off the shelf due to the large neuroscience and technology industry that makes its products and services available globally. Indeed, there are also dedicated efforts by nation states and even independent actors working either as proxies or working as virtual nations that are focused to at least understanding the brain sciences as leveraging tools that can then be utilized in a variety of international relations, inclusive of things such as politics, economics, and in some cases, even non-kinetic engagements that teeter on the edge of aggressiveness and vulnerability. Recognizing the variety of these uses has become ever more important as large-scale discourses focus upon the brain sciences as those means to exert some influence on human cognition, emotion, and behavior. In many ways, what we find is a set of brinksmanship that might be occurring, an escalation, a comparative effect that in some ways is performative. In other words, we look to what they do, whoever they may be, and recognize that it is important at least to remain apace, if not to remain ahead. The reason there certainly is economic, at least in the initial. But ever more, we understand that the neurosciences and its technologies affords what French philosopher Michel Foucault referred to as biopowerful capability. The capability of influencing individuals, communities, collectives, biologies in ways that vary from the explicit to the tacit, from the individual to the international, from the synaptic to the social. As Dr. Benedictor alluded to, this is not new. Much of the progress in the brain sciences have reflected the relative novelty of the field. In fact, I think it's important that we understand that the term neuroscience, which then reflects the titular field of neuroscience, is really only about 40 years old. When I got into the field in the late 1970s, there were four programs in the brain sciences that were dedicated and titularly referred to as neurosciences here in the United States. 4. Now, literally hundreds. And that's just the United States. What's important to note is that the efforts in the United States have in some cases been directly mirrored and in some cases surpassed by those efforts in other countries. These are the waves of brain science, brain waves as we like to refer to them. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a tremendous amount of scientific and technological integration, as seen and evidenced by the ability to literally take humans to the moon. Advancements in a variety of different fields, certainly many of them towards orienting the human condition towards what might be seen as betterment. In the 1970s, to reiterate, was the titular birth of the field of neuroscience, but that's not to say that we weren't focusing on the brain sciences before that. One might think that since humans first looked at some primordial reflecting pool and recognized that which is looking back as themselves, pose that question: what makes me me? What makes me think? And how is it then that I can engage this? Taking centenary trends through, for example, the Middle Ages, the Enlightenment, modernity, we understand the importance of understanding ourselves and understanding our brain, but not just to assess the brain, but to affect it. Human Genome Project gave rise to a host of molecular techniques that were then applied to the neurosciences to try to understand the genetic basis of our thoughts, our emotions, and behaviors, and not just understand, but perhaps incur some type of Jehovah directive. Could we perhaps affect the brain, affect ourselves, both presently and in the future? That was concatenated by much of the work of the Decade of the Brain in 1990s, which ultimately then focused upon the ability to control areas of human suffering here in the United States, the Decade of Pain Control and Research. But perdurable questions about the nature of human suffering, the nature of human experience, a phenomenological self persisted. As Dr. Benedicta alluded to earlier, we attempted very strongly in 2006 to initiate a new decade, the Decade of the Mind. Working with my colleagues at George Mason University, Sandia National Laboratories, and some international colleagues as well, we tried to get a new congressionally focused decade up and running, but we didn't quite have the momentum to do that. But those murmurings of the need for an expanded focus upon the brain science did not go unheeded. Ultimately, this is what grew into the momentum gaining the BRAIN Initiative, brain research through advancing innovative neurotechnologies, that was launched at the end of the first Obama administration and really became a hallmark of the second. The BRAIN Initiative was mirrored, and in some cases, as we noted earlier, was surpassed, or at very, very least was complemented by a number of international brain initiatives. The China Brain Project, Japan Brain Mind, the Korea Brain Project, Brain Project Argentina, globally engagement, multiple disciplines and technologies in neuroscience. But I think if this is where we recognize we're going, we might need to go back to the future, if you will. I mean, even if we simply take a look somewhat myopically at the BRAIN Initiative here in the United States, what we've argued, what Dr. Benedicta and I have argued, what my colleague John Shook and I have argued, many of my international colleagues have argued that if we're going to do the brain sciences, we need to do something we did earlier. In other words, if we look back at the Human Genome Project, we instantiated an ethical, legal, and social issues project that accompanied these projects. We've certainly called for the same, and the rise of the relatively new but now mature field of neuroethics in many ways, certainly was the response to that hearkened call. If indeed what we're going to do is engage brain research to advancing innovative neurotechnologies, then we have to ask ourselves, what is technology? Oh, for sure, we're Homo sapiens technicus. We're tool users, and we've come to the apex of our evolutionary, if not our phylogenetic ladder, by utilizing the tools that we have at our disposal and building others anew. But it's not just a question of building and using the tools. It's not just that we become Homo sapiens technicus, but really become Homo sapiens technologicus. Techne logos. Logos, a detailed and rational analysis of the thing. And in this case, that thing is techne. The tools we build, the tools we devise, the tools we develop, the tools we use and how we use them. And in this way, perhaps neurotechnology allows something deeper, an analysis of the tools we use to explore the nature of ourselves. Hence, we've called for neuroethics in that regard. If indeed we're taking an innovative approach to the brain sciences, then we need to take an innovative approach to the way we look at the tools we developed. And that becomes important because if we examine neuroscience and or any science and technology as viable public goods, in other words, aimed at some benevolent goal, wanting to do good, well, what does that mean? It needs to be instrumental to other goods, not the only good. It must be meaningful, but then we have to ask what public, what goods? And as soon as we ask that question, we resituate neuroscience and technology on the globalized stage of the 21st century. It's international. It's increasingly non-Western. And therefore, it needs to at least acknowledge, if not accommodate, be sensitive and respect pluralist needs, values, norms, And it needs to understand that neuroscience and technology both affects and is affected by economics, politics, and power balances. Much has been said about science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and the need for that education, the need for that policy, the need for such advancement in those domains as we move into the ever more technological 21st century. But we've argued for more. We cannot disconnect the technology from the anthropological and ethical dimensions in which that technology has been generated. Science and technology are human endeavors for human endeavors, and therefore we must understand the humanity and how humanity uses the tools that it creates. We refer to that as remaining in step, integrated science, technology, ethics, and policy studies. It will require a progressive ethic, for sure. Science needs to lead, because if it doesn't, ethics becomes too performative, becomes far too fictional, far too hypothetical. Ethics describes, and in some cases, models issues and problems, opposes methods for redress and possible resolutions. It really is a balancing act. Ethical balance requires such finesse. How is it that we're going to engage neuroscience and technology given the trends in globalization? If we simply beat our breasts and call for a Western ethic, well then, perhaps rightly so, is the accusation of some form of imperialism. But if we adopt a more laissez-faire attitude, then we devolve to what may be ethical relativism. Do we then say, when in Rome, do as Romans do? That's a form of communitarianism, or at very, very least local collectivism. Or do we appreciate the larger collective? Truly cosmopolitas. Working together with Professor Benedictor, my colleague John Shook, and others, we've taken what's called a benefit risk threat prediction approach. And we need to be prepared for the global trends of rising capabilities in neuroscience and technology coming from a variety of cultures whose history, whose needs, whose values, whose mores, whose ethics are different, and therefore may allow different levels of progress in different domains that may not be universally acceptable, but certainly need to become part of the discourse. And that discourse needs to look forward in a realistic way. 3 vistas, the most proximate being the vista of probability, what can be done within the next 5 years. Based upon what can be done, very often we can view further, what things become possible. And then we look to the vast future, the 30-year horizon, to those things that are potential. How will we wade into these vistas? How will we walk into this ever-deepening ocean of probability, possibility, and potentiality of the things that we can do to discern what we should do? Approaching the questions of neuroscience and technology and health promotions and ethics on a global stage requires what we call the propensity and preparedness of P's, pragmatic analysis of preparatory posture, plurality of those individuals, in other words, globalized individuals who are involved in the discourse and dialectic, some form of pessimism, at least via skepsis, to say what could go wrong, what will go wrong, and are we prepared? And from that, prudence in our decisions and actions, not only in what we do, but what we may be prepared for in the future, and ultimately the substantiation of those means and methods through effective multinational policy. Working with Dr. Benedictor in the past, we've proposed game theory in practice, and I'll not bore you with the details of this. Please feel free to contact me if this is something you want to delve deeper into. Identifying risk scenarios, crafting strategies, examining settings and conditions, creating strategies that are relevant, and trying to articulate a robust framework to remain effective and flexible, because fixity of our purpose in trying to keep things ethically sound while marching science ahead requires flexibility in our methods, and those flexibilities require multinational, international, and globalized discourse, and a dialectical process, a true dialectical process of balancing theses with antitheses to try to bring not only a synthetic ethics together, but a syncretic ethics together, one that accommodates, respects, and is sensitive to multiple beliefs. So in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, what I present to you is, if you will, what's swimming around in that ocean of probability, possibility, and potentiality. And I posit to you that the relationship between any science, technology, ethics, and policy, and specifically the brain sciences, is one that can be likened to these 3 creatures. Science and technology is like an albacore. It is fast, it is streamlined, And we view it in ways of great benefit. We say that, yeah, we can harvest these things, but we need to be sensitive to what we harness and how we harvest them. It's fast, potent, strong. Ethics is like the creature we see on your lower left. For those of you who are not ichthyologically versed, let me help you with this. Evidently, that is a shark, and it is a big shark. Look at its relative size to the diver next to it. This is a basking shark. It's big. Yes, it's a shark. It has scales which you rub the wrong way and a tremendous tail that stands 10 feet that if it whacks you, it'll hurt you. But look at that mouth. Tremendous gape. No teeth. That's ethics. Big mouth. You rub it the wrong way, it'll hurt you. Gets whacked in the tail, it'll hurt you, but no teeth. International policy and law of the creature on the right. Big jaws, big teeth. It's our duty, if not obligation and obligate responsibilities, to not only appreciate what these things are and what they can do, but to help to craft the teeth in the mouth of the creature of policy, so that what it's taking a bite out of is those real and potential harms, and at the same time, engaging those things that are beneficial. It'll take persons such as you, participatory purpose, development of policy, which should then facilitate access to knowledge, translational schemes, awareness of limits, provision of goods, and mitigations of burdens and harms. And it begs the questions: what ethics? For what cultures? In what combinations? And what are the new neuroethics that will be able to serve the new global shift? If we consider these to be classes of engagement, I think it becomes important that our next class that we share with each other is towards a structural and functional approach to such a globally relevant ethics. If what I've done in these past 25 minutes is to illuminate the candle that shines into that which comes ahead of us, the real task for us, ladies and gentlemen, is to develop what that ethics look like, to keep that candle lit as the winds of change blow. It's been a pleasure to speak with you this morning. I look forward to our ongoing work in this effort. I look forward to our collaboration. I look forward to the possibility of questions at this time.
So Jim, thank you very much for this sweeping overview. You have done so much in the field of ethics with regard to brain science, with regard to the research into the essence, so to say, of the human being as which it is regarded today. And our common interest, Jim, and I'm so grateful for this, was always to address one crucial issue for the future of globalization, which is: how does brain research, the research into the human mind in a more broader sense, impact the self-image of the human being, impact the awareness of ourselves, and change the image of ourselves over the coming years? And I see that there is a transformation, namely the transhumanist transformation that wants to make the human being a kind of biological machine, connected to kind of neuronal self-referential channels, but without much culture, sweeping away religion, sweeping away most of the features that we thought were human. And I also see the rise, as you mentioned in your talk, of actors on the global stage like China, who don't have a history of ideas in the background to deal in ethical or self-critical ways with the emergence of these new options that rise out of bioscience. For example, in February 2019, published in Nature, the steering of a rat brain by a human brain, the so-called brain-brain interface, human mind control of a rat. Different species start to control each other. And all these, I think, are developments that open up a completely new window of opportunities, but also of options to change the human being that are unprecedented and that we have to consider, as you said, it on a global level. But what, and this is my question, what do you make out of these new options? How will brain science, the exploration of the human mind impact the coming years of globalization? Will it be only the biggest business on the globe, or will it be something more profound?
Rolly, that's a wonderful question. I mean, you've alluded to so much in the preamble to the question that I think it's rich, and I'll try to provide the most the richest answer I can. There are a number of factors that I think become very important to consider, and some of them I alluded to in the presentation that I gave to your group. Certainly, the rise of countries that heretofore had been not necessarily present or prominent in the area of science and technology represents a reality. I mean, we see our trans-Pacific near-peer competitor China coming to the fore and being explicit that by the year 2030, 35, it wants to be one of the global leaders in the brain sciences and technology in a variety of different applications and domains. And clearly, I think there's a nationalistic trend that goes behind that, but they also recognize the economic viability and, to allude to what you said, the potency of the brain sciences to assess and affect the human being on a variety of levels, from the cellular all the way to the social, from the personal, as I said, all the way to the political. And that does not go unnoticed. Our transatlantic peer competitor, for example, Russia, working in somewhat different modus operandi, is equally dedicated to the brain sciences in a variety of different applications, ranging from medicine to the military. And here too, what we see is Russian influence together with China in some cases with regard to things like artificial intelligence and big data, may be able to create waves of capability and possibility, not directly via Russia, but perhaps through international proxies and or by influencing markets. But I think it also becomes important to define what different cultures hold to be normal, what different cultures hold to be good, and how those definitions of norm, normality, and good are then utilized and in some cases leveraged not only for intra-national development of the brain sciences, but international. In other words, the viabilities for things like research tourism. If the ethics of one country have certain prohibitions and restrictions and constraints, well, then other countries may provide differences in ethics that may be seen as latitudes, or somewhat more derogatively, ethics dumping. In other words, dump your ethics at the door and come here and do A, B, C, X, Y, and Z. As well, though the advances, the developments, the progress, the tools, the methods that are gained under such research stratagems and with that momentum might then be solicitous and directly attractive of medical tourism, the idea of cosmetic neurocognitive sciences, utilizing neurocognitive sciences not just to treat diseases or injuries, but in some cases to work preventatively, which is really a guise for saying in ways that provide enablements, optimizations, and enhancements, which then brings us to the question, how good should we be? How much suffering should we alleviate? To what end? In whom? And who will get the quote goodies? And what does that then do for the norms of how we define ourselves as human? What becomes, if you will, the mid-range of the Gaussian distribution of diversity? And what should we do with regard to those individuals who are diverse? Create some uniformity, create some new normality? And what are the definitions if in fact the tools that we use to assess what is normal in structure and function are the very same tools that then allow us to identify those substrates as targets?
Yeah.
So the question is I think an important one, because more and more we're seeing is the rise of global powers that are using neuroscience and technology as leverage. And then we must ask, what does that do with regard to the relations of not only these developed countries, but the relationships of developed countries to developing countries and to undeveloped countries? What does that do for the neurocapabilized haves versus the have-nots? And how do we create a global discourse and engage a true dialectic that needs not to agree on all points, but needs to have some methodological consensus on how points of dissensus are going to be approached, dealt with, resolved, or at very, very least sustained?
Yeah. So I would agree with that. I just see that there is a power grip, especially also from China, but also from other authoritarian regimes on neuroscience to establish it as a kind of military tool in the most strict sense. As you know, just a few months ago, the Chief of National Intelligence of the United States published a very spectacular essay in the Wall Street Journal saying basically that China and other powers are working with all they can on the super soldier, so to transforming via brain science human beings in better combatants. But this is only the tip of the iceberg, I guess. And what the challenge is, in my view, I don't know if you agree, is really in the background on a more sophisticated level to create a common concept of the human being, because the Confucian concept is not the Christian concept and the Muslim concept is not the Orthodox concept. So I think what brain sciences forces us to is to really create a first common understanding what a human being is. And it is a Herculean task because we are not prepared to that. I don't know how you see it.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that one of the things that has come to the fore as a consequence of not only brain sciences per se, but a number of different approaches to science and technology that have then been put upon the global stage, in some cases in concert, in other cases in contrast, with longstanding humanistic approaches, such as, for example, sociology, anthropology, political science, even religion. The question is, what are we? Can the brain sciences afford us some measure of ourselves? Can we use the brain sciences not only as a lens to examine the structure and function of the brain, but a mirror to turn that back upon ourselves, to be able to get something of a, as you say, a common vision of what it is to be human? In other words, how is it the human brain works, inclusive of the culturally embedded human brain? And I think that there is some benefit to that. Certainly some of the work of the author Sam Harris has posed that the brain sciences may be, quote, something of a new religion in the literal sense. In other words, religare, to bring us back together. Not in any way to superimpose or to dispose of other religions, because belief very often engages the transcendent and existential questions that cannot be addressed by science, but to understand who we are, what we are, why we believe certain things, why we have certain rituals, and what it's going to take for us to work in an ever more globalized, connected, and informationally as well as practically engaged world. I think your point there is an important one, and it's something that both you and I have written about frequently, together with our colleagues John Shook and Kevin Fitzgerald and others. And I think that the issue here is, can we then engage at least some aspect of the brain sciences, whether we call that neuroecology or whether we call that neurohumanism, or perhaps some variant of neuroethics that takes the larger set of the two traditions of neuroethics, not only the ethics of brain science, but the underlying neurocognitive sciences of how we as humans make decisions about what we hold to be morally, ethically, socially, legally good, not good, right and wrong, and create a larger construct, a meta ethic, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
a sort of a meta approach to what it is we are, what it is we do, and how we do it. That's my hope. But you know, in such an enterprise, you have to recognize that there's something of a Janusian face that goes along with that. That's a two-edged sword. We'd like to think that what we'll do with that is utilize that for ways that are, by some definition, benevolent. But once again, it comes back to who's good, what justice, what rationale, and the capability that can be afforded by such level of insight and such level of intervention, innovation, I think certainly must be appreciated. So the need to develop these discourses and dialectics now is ever more important. As you may recall, over a decade ago, we wrote a paper calling for a dawn flight of the owl of Minerva. And I think that the call for that is ever more potent, ever more viable, and ever more valuable today as it was over a decade ago.
So we are just a bit behind schedule, but allow me a final question posed by Miriam Gruber via the chat function, and I read it to you. To what extent is gender an issue in neuroscience? Or more concretely, to what extent are data, but also views of women included in brain sciences? In medicine and in technology, it is largely the case that research is simply done with mainly male data, and the results, for example, drugs, safety measures, are then simply applied identically to men and women, which is a huge problem. Question by Miriam Gruber.
That's an excellent question. There's actually an organization called WINS, Women in Neurosciences, that has addressed the issue of a whole host of gender questions, problems, and possibilities, not only about the female neuroscientist, neurologist, neurocognitive scientist, and what that affords as career benefits, but the actual practices themselves. I mean, you're absolutely right. So much of the data and information we have is predicated upon utilizing male subjects and or targeting males as the viability of these outcomes. But I think what we're also using the neurosciences to gain insight to is the nature of our maleness and femaleness along a spectrum of neurobiopsychosocial capabilities. I mean, here's some of the work of the differentiated brain, male brain, female brain, what effects might make these the same or what effects might make these different, and how that then occurs throughout the lifespan, and what that means for our interpersonal, social, and perhaps even legal interactions in defining the nature of the self become ever more important. Questions, for example, that arise about the nature of gender dysphoria. Is that a biological condition? Is that a sociological or psychological condition? Can we utilize, for example, the brain sciences to gain insight to the way individuals' brain is both structured and function, and as a consequence, tailor things like education, tailor things like commercial enterprise, tailor things like the working environment, and perhaps in some cases, tailor the way we socially, medically, and legally regard and treat others. But here too, we must be cautious because we must understand that science and technology and neuroscience and technology makes ardent leaps in about 5 to 10-year periods. So whatever science we use to create those pediments, to create those perspectives, and to create those definitions must be current, must be flexible, must be self-critical and self-revising, so that we don't fall into the technophilic trap of utilizing technologies to in some way prospectively define what we want to be, and not necessarily utilizing it as a clear lens to see what indeed we are.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's always a great pleasure to interact with you, and I'm looking forward to our upcoming work together. Thank you so much.